Catherine. I just did the intro for the panel, so if you want to go ahead and start and do your screen share, that would be great.
Great. Apologies for being a little late. Let's see. Okay, are you able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Let me just go into presentation mode. Okay. Well, thank you for inviting us to come and talk about the Natural and Working Lands proposal that we developed based on the executive order that Governor Brown put out in March of 2020. Today, I wanted to just go over a little bit of kind of the purpose and underlying motivation of, that led us to do this work. Talk a little bit about those that we engaged in the process. Talk briefly about the goals that we proposed and the strategy recommendations we made, and then leave it with some of the things that we think are top of mind in terms of our legislative priorities. So, as I'm sure many of you are aware, the International Panel on Climate Change has made it abundantly clear that we cannot avoid the worst impacts of climate change without thinking about the important role the land sector makes in helping us reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and keep our temperature warming to 1.5 or below, and also the importance of doing that. So I think that's certainly an important motivator for making sure that we don't leave the land sector out of our comprehensive climate action plans. Some research that colleagues of mine at the Nature Conservancy did in 2017, published in 2017 with a host of other collaborators, showed that nature can be 1/3 of the needed solution by 2030, and evaluated the role of different pathways and management practices that can be advanced to sequester more carbon in natural and working lands. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, the Governor Brown directed the Oregon Global Warming Commission, in coordination with OD, Oregon Department of Agriculture, Forestry, and OWEB, to develop a proposal on the potential for the land sector to contribute to broader climate goals. In addition to these agencies, we also worked closely with the Department of Land Conservation and Development and DEQ, as well as many others, as we considered and developed our proposal. The vision that we have for how to approach the land sector recognizes that we have both the need to manage to resilience and to manage to the most robust carbon sink we can achieve. And so in interpreting that on the landscape, that means in some places, we actually do need to reduce carbon on the land. And in other places, we have great opportunities to increase the carbon sink. And we've got to think through both of those sides of the equation to make sure we are adapting to the changes in the climate changes that we can't avoid, while also trying to mitigate and reduce the climate change that we can. So we started this work really in December of 2019. We had a preliminary conversation about this work at the commission, and then in earnest started work in July of 2020. And in that process, we did a series of outreach to the folks that follow the commission, but also through a variety of venues. We engaged tribes, landowners, federal and state agencies, technical assistance providers like all of you, landowner interest groups, conservation and environmental organizations, environmental justice leaders, and the general public. We talked about our natural and working lands goals, really starting at our July meeting, but just about consistently across the rest of our meetings that occurred in 2020 and 2021 to develop our proposal. And in total, we reached more than 1,000 Oregonians in one form or fashion, and or heard from them in one form or fashion to help influence our proposal. So the outreach looked like this over time. We started with conversations with our partner agencies and commissions. Then we did a targeted survey that OWEB helped us do out to landowners. We got significant input from agricultural interests, a little less input from forest landowners, and then interest from a variety of conservation and environmental justice organizations and tribes. So started off with the targeted survey, and then we had an open-ended online survey that was posted from January until April of 2021. And then we had focused discussions with a number of groups and across the state to help us kind of deepen some of the information that we got from the two surveys that we did and from the input that we got at commission meetings, and used all of that to help us frame the recommendations that we made. So in terms of the input that we got on goals and metrics, as you may imagine, there was quite a diversity of input, but there was a consistent messaging around the urgency of climate action. There was pretty consistent input that these should be on top of the state's existing sector-based goals, that the land sector should help us be more ambitious than we have already set in the sector-based goals that Oregon manages to. They should be informed by science, including traditional ecological knowledge. They should help us advance equity across the state. They should be designed in a way to hold us accountable to determining whether or not we're meeting those goals. And then recognizing that the information on the land sector is in early development, still has some issues around our ability to precisely evaluate the land sector's role. We also heard that we should embed in our process continuous improvement. So don't assume that we can just set a goal today and that it will be the right goal for us over time, but that we may need to modify and improve it over time. And so we had engaged a number of technical experts on the topic and looked at the available research that is out there for what's the art of the possible in natural and working lands in Oregon, and identified this goal of sequestering at least an additional 5 million metric tons of CO2e per year in Oregon's natural and working lands by 2030, and at least 9.5 million metric tons of CO2e per year by 2050. And we also reflected the input that we'd gotten, that this should be on top of our existing goals. We are going to measure that against 2010 to 2019 activity-based business as usual net carbon sequestration baseline. And I can talk a little bit more about that later if you're interested. And then as I mentioned, that we wanted to make sure that we updated it over time. And so to support that, the next two things that we want to do is develop activity-based metrics and goals and community impact goals. And that helps us get at being able to hold ourselves accountable and track our progress in terms of the activity-based metrics and goals. And the community impact metrics helps us make sure that we're building equity in and that we're paying attention to the triple bottom line that we all want to see for Oregon's natural and working lands and natural resource management. We've got a lot of input on the strategies that we should adopt and the recommendations that we should make relative to how we can meet these outcomes. We certainly want them to be equitable and developed through an equitable and collaborative process, informed by science, as I mentioned earlier. Similar to the goal, also the strategies should be that we want whatever policies and programs we design to advance natural and working lands, that they be that we do those programs and policies as efficiently as possible. Again, in addition to the continuous improvement in the goal, we were encouraged to make sure there was continuous improvement in any programs and the process for advancing this. We heard loud and clear and look forward to hearing more input today about the need for expanded technical assistance and education capacity that came in from all of the surveys that we did and input. And then we were also encouraged to kind of evaluate and eliminate current disincentives. So in addition to thinking about all the positive new things we could do, are there some things that are preventing us from having the kind of impact we would like to have? There was also an strong interest in recognizing and rewarding good practices. So making sure that we're identifying those early adopters that can help other landowners identify ways that they can increase sequestration through changes in management practices, and that we're really celebrating those the folks that are doing the great work on the ground. It was recognized that while many of the practices that we can use to increase sequestration will have long-term benefits for the landowners and land managers, we also were encouraged to recognize that there are transition costs for adopting new practices, and to make sure that we were addressing any transition costs that we might have. There was a strong interest in having us align whatever strategies we identified with other state, federal, and tribal needs and goals. And then finally, we did hear significant input on including, in addition to the major focus that we heard from folks on incentives and creating incentive programs, we did hear that there were some probably judicious and strategic improvements in regulations that should be part of our recommendations. We identified 4 overarching strategies and then a number of measures underneath strategy 3. So the first was recognizing that the federal government and federal lands are going to be an important part of how Oregon meets its climate action in the land sector, making sure that the state is doing everything we can to leverage the opportunities on federal lands and the investments that we are seeing coming out of, for example, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, to make sure that the state of Oregon can take advantage of all of that to advance climate smart natural and working lands practices. Once some of that funding plays out, we do want to look at options for creating a sustained source of state funding to increase sequestration in natural and working lands. One of the things that we have heard from experience in other states is that, having a way to forecast what kinds of funding is going to be coming available is critical to designing effective programs and creating that an understanding amongst landowners and certainty for technical service providers about what might be coming that we can take advantage of. There are a number of recommendations that we made in terms of funding and directing agencies to take action to advance the natural and working land strategies, and I'll go into those in more detail in just a minute. And then certainly a need to continue to make investments to improve our understanding of the sequestration capacity in natural and working lands. We have information that helps us understand what our current sequestration rates are, but it's imperfect. And as I mentioned, there's a need for kind of a continuous improvement of that understanding. So we can, not only so that we can have a second way of tracking our progress, but also so we can be as strategic as possible in investing in this kind of work. So in strategy 3, so this is the strategy that included direction to the agencies to take on some additional actions. We have recommendations associated with maintaining and enhancing Oregon's statewide land use planning framework. That land use planning is already estimated to sequester significant carbon compared to other jurisdictions that don't have the kind of land use planning policies and programs that we have here in Oregon. So we want to enhance and maintain those. Second, we identified the need to establish a comprehensive climate smart agricultural program that could in part be administered through the Oregon Ag Heritage Program, but would likely need some additional capacity and structure outside of that to create a full and comprehensive climate smart agricultural program. The third major area for our work is to focus on climate smart forest management. And in that, we identified a number of more specific recommendations, including investing and expanding in urban tree canopies, adopting the Forest Accord recommendations that recently came out, which will have climate mitigation benefits. Beyond that, thinking about ways that we could increase sequestration in forests and recognizing that there are some potential short-term consequences for doing that to the timber industry, and that would need to be well thought out in order to make sure that we are designing the programs in a way that would provide benefits across the board to the varied interests that there are in the different sectors of the forest products industry in Oregon. Next, the need for really expanding our reforestation capacity. This is something that we hear across the U.S. as a need, and it's certainly something that we saw as a big need following the wildfires from 2020, and certainly 2021 will be the same. So needing to build back some of our infrastructure for production of plant materials for reforestation is really important. Back to the vision, where we recognize the need for both increased resilience in our forests, in addition to increasing the carbon sink. We need to think about forest resiliency treatments as part of that comprehensive picture. And then propose to expand the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program to also be able to assist forest landowners. We had quite a bit of technical support on coastal carbon-rich ecosystems, sometimes referred to as blue carbon. And there are a lot of opportunities. The acreage is not great, but the sequestration potential per acre is. And as you all well know, there are incredible opportunities or co-benefits that come along with that kind of work. And then finally, really to help us understand how we can best implement all this work, how it might intersect with Oregon's economy, the need for a workforce and economic development study was identified. In thinking about what kind of comes first and what we might be able to accomplish in the 2022 session, certainly want to, it would be great to be able to pass legislation that would put our recommendations in statute. That may be a little premature, but interested in having conversations with this group and talking more with the legislators about the possibility of doing that in 2022. We certainly want to make sure that the agencies have the authority to accept federal funds from the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and if passed, a reconciliation bill. We want to make sure that we can continue to develop our proposal by having capacity and funding to engage stakeholders in development of the activity and community-based metrics and track progress towards the goals and implementation of the natural and working lands recommendations. Another near-term priority is the workforce needs and economic benefits analysis, because I think that will help us make smart decisions about how we design programs. The reforestation infrastructure strategic plan would be a great thing to start in on. We can do that individually as the state of Oregon, or work with some of our neighbors who are also interested in doing that. And then finally, passing legislation to codify the Forest Accord recommendations. Those are the ideas that, that some commission members have had about what might be possible. And it would be great to hear all of your feedback about what might be missing from this list or what might need more thinking before we can move forward. So with that, I'll close and answer any questions that folks might have, or we can hold the questions and go to the other panelists and then come back. At your pleasure, Jan.
So why don't we have our legislators make some remarks and then go to questions from all of you, if that would work.
Would you like me to start, Jan?
Please.
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to really thank Kathy for all her work on this report. Kathy is also going to be presenting on this same subject to the Senate Energy and Environment Committee next week, actually just a week from today. And I just put in the chat a link to the agenda for that meeting, so you can tune in and you'll get to see Vice Chair Findley there, and me, and Kathy, and whoever else. It's, of course, all by Zoom. You know, when the work on the sequestration potential and the important role that our natural lands have to play in climate action, when that was first raised, I remember it being framed in terms of natural lands without mention of working lands. But very early on, it became clear that the only way we can move forward is by not isolating natural lands from working lands, but rather thinking of the two together, particularly for a state like Oregon, where our working lands are so important to our economy and our identity. And I think that really is key. And I think for many people who live in my district, I represent much of Northeast and Southeast Portland, they don't fully appreciate the extent to which our working lands properly kept in production and with the right methods can really help to meet the goals that they really believe in terms of climate. And I think that that has been a vital part of this conversation. As Kathy mentioned, a real effort was made to broaden the base of people who were consulted here to get that kind of picture and to come up with something that really would benefit people all over Oregon, and where Oregon could really step up. Obviously, we have to do our part in reducing our emissions in general, in meeting the climate challenge. But we're so blessed in terms of our natural lands, whether we're talking about rangelands or croplands or forest lands or tidal, coastal lands. Many of our our fellow states are not blessed in that same way. And so we can really, really lift beyond our weight. And this report, I think is really getting us off in the right direction. I'll just start with those preliminary comments. I know we'll want to talk a little bit about the next session and what can and cannot be done in the next session. So I'll hold off on that, and we'll come back to that discussion. Okay, one of you other two guys.
Thank you, Senator Dimbro. I'll start. Representative Helm, I beat you to the non-mute button. So, thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to participate. I am one of the newest members, if not the newest member of the Global Warming Commission, and I have not been able to attend a meeting. I think that's coming up in the very near future, so which I look forward to. This is a great report. As you read through this report, it does a lot of good things. I would advocate and say that the Natural Working Lands Carbon Sequestration Program has been going on for decades. When you look back and you see in the conservation districts, the CRP programs and the other programs that are out there, and since the Dust Bowl days, where you do in strips, I mean, those practices have been in place for a long time, and I think it's very opportune time to start recognizing some of that work that that agriculturists are doing now and have been doing forever. What gives me a little concern is when you start quantifying some things like sequestering an additional 5 million metric tons. The problem is I don't know that we really know what we do now. I mean, an adequate inventory is something that is pretty elusive. But I think all lands are working lands in a lot of regard. And when you're in my district, which is 36% of the state, I don't think there's a piece of land that's not doing something productive. So I think they're all working lands. I think this is the identification of it, the validation of what we're doing now is a great thing, and I look forward to that. I think it's a great thing to do. I'm probably not quite as optimistic as Senator Dimbro on the 2022 session, as it's roaring upon us. So that's a pretty long list, and it's a pretty short session. So we'll have to see. But I think it's a good viable goal. But I would say don't be overly disappointed if it's not achieved. One person told me, a colleague a few years ago, that it takes a couple of years of cooking something before it comes to fruition. So I think the first shot at the proposal for the carbon sequestration goals is a great one, that we ought to look at that, and we ought to try to figure out how to cook it a little bit. So I'll let Representative Helm take over. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. I'll echo Senator Dembro's comments of thanks to Kathy and the Global Warming Commission for bringing together strands of information that we have had at our disposal for many years and combining them now with some of the data needs or the data around our needs to reduce impacts on our climate. I think Senator Finley's right. Some of the land practices that we're talking about are centuries old. Some of them have been elbowed aside by industrial practices that we thought were a good idea in the 50s and 60s and 70s and are turning out to be long-term damaging to our soil and how we do agriculture. The recommendations, I'll just say, and this is a shout out to Senator Dembro, are so through 2017. And I say that because in 2017, Senator Dembro and I put forward some prototypes of a climate response bill that included money for natural and working lands in more or less the same sort of categories that the Global Warming Commission report has set. Now, we disagreed on the impact of what being part of a nationwide cap and trade system would be on the economy of the state. But there was a lot of agreement on the value of natural and working lands and being able to support agriculture, ranching, and forestry in the state because we understood well the carbon sequestration capabilities. So now we have a clear-eyed view of the benefits, and yet we still have to figure out a way to pay for it, which is the trick, right? So I'm looking forward to hearing everybody's thoughts today. And from my perspective, I am really happy to be talking to your group because I think our soil and water conservation districts are our boots on the ground and our best interface with Oregonians that do this work. You're trusted and you're knowledgeable. So you can be our ambassadors. And if we can find the money to support some of the practices and take opportunities where our farmers, ranchers, and other land managers think these techniques are beneficial to them, then we have a winning combination. And I find that to be really exciting.
So Jan, if I may, looking towards the 22 session, as Senator Finley said, it is very hard to get big new policy across in a short session. Every legislator just has 2 bills to submit. That's as opposed to in the long session when we are not limited in the number of bills we can introduce. Each committee only gets 3 bills that it can introduce. And I think even the governor only gets 3 bills, 2 or 3 bills. So, we're very limited. I will say that limitation is for good reason because the session is just 5 weeks long. And if a bill doesn't make it out of committee in a week, it's dead, essentially. So, but I think that for the most part, what we're talking about here is not really new policy. In a lot of cases, what we're talking about is funding programs that are already in place, or perhaps that are within the purview of different agencies already. And one of the things I'm thinking of is the Ag Heritage Program. I'm really pleased that the report includes a recommendation that we come up with some funding for that program. That's really long overdue. It's so important for keeping ag lands as working ag lands. making sure that it doesn't, that it's not used for other purposes or consolidated into large farms, when really it could be very functional as a small family farm. And some of the other really important benefits of that Ag Heritage program, I think it really fits in with this very well. I'll stop there. Maybe my colleagues have some other thoughts, of things that could, where this could be useful. Ken, I don't know. Do you have any bills? I don't have any bills available, but again, I don't really see this as, for the most part, a policy bill kind of requirement.
Good question. In the House, we are having such change in our membership right now. That's going to affect our committees. And so what bills are available to what committees right now is still a little bit up in the air. I think that will resolve after the legislative days next week. And I have always of the mind that if you have some capacity, if you have an extra bill in the short session, it is a good time to start a conversation like this. It gives you 2 bites at the apple with legislators focused, and then in effect a captive audience to some extent during the 5 weeks we're there, and you can get something rolling. And if that was a possibility here, I think it's a good time to go ahead and start the conversation.
Would you like to add something, Senator Finley?
I would, thank you. Representative Helm is exactly right. I mean, both chambers are having some committee leadership changes through members changing and agendas focusing. But I think Representative Helm is absolutely right. An apple's better served better in smaller bites than repeatedly. So trying to get major legislation or some of this stuff through without being sound tested is more difficult. So I think, it'd be best to try to float some stuff around and have some dialogues and conversations. Certainly, these issues need to be presented to committees and gone through and through at least an informational process. So, but it's a pretty dynamic process. One never thinks that it is, but I think it really is this year more than probably others with the changes in leadership of both chamber committees. The changes in members. I mean, there's several members of the Senate that have, termed out or moved on from other venues or moved out of the state. So it's pretty dynamic, and you need to bring it's an educational process to get people to understand what they are. So I it's a worthwhile program, but I think it needs to move slowly and deliberately.
Great comments from all of you. I think that's true. We need to take it in small bites and build it up to the program that it can be. You're probably all aware, all of you legislators, because you've probably been in a meeting where myself or Colt or others have been pushing for short-term funding of OAHP. And that's just one step towards OAHP being much more than it has been. Would you like to address some questions at this point?
Absolutely.
Sure. Okay, those who have a question, can you please raise your hand if possible? Nancy.
Good afternoon. Kathy, Senator, Representative Helm, nice to see you all. And Senator Finley, nice to meet you. As you probably know, I now am the Executive Director for East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District, but worked with you all on climate legislation for quite a while before this. And I know that, we were one of the districts that sent in a letter of support for the DEQ to include funding for sequestration efforts as part of 2004, the EO from the governor. And we were unsuccessful in that. And that's pretty disappointing. And I think to Senator Finley's comment, the sort of like-minded measurement of soil sequestration is still an active question. And so while we have a lot of land, depending on what happens on that land, that soil continues to sequester carbon or it doesn't. And what the formulas are for that is really challenging. And so I was curious, Kathy, when you mentioned that there are possibilities, or we need to find possibilities for investments for sustainable funding for sequestration beyond this. I'm curious if there are thoughts on that, or if that's part of what you're hoping to introduce in this coming short session to start a conversation, and or if it's part of the federal bill and how we might be able to tap some of those quote unquote infrastructure dollars. So our district and our board is very interested in participating in the solution on this front. And while, a significant portion of our district is urban, we also have some of the last farm land in Multnomah County and are very interested in seeing what we can do to be part of this, as well as working with our colleagues across the strait. So I don't know who makes the most sense to answer that, but
I'm
there
happy
you go.
to take a first stab and then open it up. There is significant interest in Congress and in the administration to improve our information on the sequestration potential of natural and working lands. There are proposals to greatly expand the U.S. Forest Service's Forest Inventory and Analysis Program, but also to start to collect carbon data from the natural resource inventory that NRCS manages that will really help with getting a better handle on soil carbon. I imagine that many of you may have been maybe tracking USDA's Climate Smart Agriculture and Forestry partnership program that they have been getting public input on starting last spring, and then most recently with a request for information that was due on November 1st. My impression is that there's going to be a lot of opportunity through that program as well to think about how we can improve information, but also develop strategies for scaling some of the practices that provide benefits from a climate perspective, but significant benefits, co-benefits for other purposes as well.
I know that there is in the future potential to look at funding some of the agency positions to be able to support this program. But I might also say that we at the Soil and Water Conservation Districts also are going to need to get more staff added to serve all of the constituents. Most of our districts cover a whole county. So we hope that in the long run, there might be some consideration of that need as well.
Absolutely. That's in part why we, and I think Senator Dembro was the one that recommended this on the commission, include a workforce and economic development study to really help us get our arms, more specifically around what we should be doing to invest in technical assistance for landowners. So just wanted to emphasize the importance of advancing that work so that we can provide the technical assistance that will be needed to make this work happen.
Thank you. We have Claire, and then after Claire, Standing.
Thank you, panel, for explaining this. One of the things that we're looking at is a paradigm shift of the population to roll into the global climate problem. One of the things that I heard earlier in the presentation is the idea of urban tree canopy. And so what we need to do is we need to engage not only the large landowners, but also the urban landowners and small, excuse me, I shouldn't say landowners, I should say residents, because that's part of the group. We shouldn't just limit it to landowners. So residents, whether rental or whatever. So on an urban basis, but on a small farms basis. So one of the things, one of the small program is, as Senator Dembro said, there's programs that are already in place. One of the programs that has been, it's been on a hiatus is the Oregon Wildlife Habitat Conservation and Management Program. And that one is one that small acreage residents and owners with their owners can enroll in, that can be used for carbon sequestration and that kind of thing. So just reviving programs like that would be really helpful. And so that's about it as far as for now. So thank you for listening. And just a question, I haven't read the whole thing all the way through. So is there any other areas where urban and small acreage people are engaged in stepping up to the plate for this plan? Thank you.
Dan, can I say something about
please do.
Yeah, and sorry, I just had to answer a phone call. So Claire, I got really excited when you started talking about urban forestry and reforestation. And what I wanted to say, obviously, I'm very pleased that that's part of the recommendation, but even more so, given the experience that we had last summer with that heat event, at the end of June, in my district, the side of the district where I live, I'm really fortunate. We have a lot of trees. It's a really, we're blessed with a good canopy. But on the opposite side of the district, that's not the case, even though it's not that far away. And from one side of the district to the other, the heat difference was like 20 degrees, and maybe more than that, actually. So those areas that didn't have a lot of trees, that had a lot of concrete and asphalt, that's where people, really suffered. I mean, it was tough where we were, but that's where they really suffered. And I think that, what we're talking about here is the intersection of environmental health and public health. And that is a very powerful intersection. And I think that as we're looking at framing this agenda in terms of what we need to address most immediately, I think we need to look at those elements that also have a really strong public health component to them, whether we're talking about trees or clean water. Those are elements of this report's recommendations that I think we may be able to take faster action on.
Okay, Stan, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, we've heard each of our panelists mention that a lot of what we ought to be doing, we already know we ought to be doing. A lot of the practices have been identified from the past. Yet we all know that in the future, we're going to have lots more information coming at us, a lot more detail on individual practices. And the information is coming from many sources. It's coming from the federal through NRCS and other agencies. It's coming through our universities. It's coming through our agencies who have different programs. But what I'm wondering is there a logical home in the state to serve as a clearinghouse for collecting all of this stuff and figuring out what are the best practices in Oregon that make most sense for us in the diversity of environments we have. And it's not just the practices of what you do to your land, but how do you monitor your land? And what are the best practices for upkeeping what we implement down the road? Is there a logical home for all of this, and how could we make that happen?
A great point. I think Senator Dembro, you and I were talking about that last week, Senator Golden. We don't have kind of currently have a single home that would cover all of these different topics. But being able to do that would be beneficial, I think, both having it go through the channels that are different working land stakeholders already engage in, like the Department of Agriculture and Forestry and OWEB and others, but also thinking about a way to bring that together in one place, or at least having a landing page to help people go and find that kind of information. That could happen through the Global Warming Commission, or it could happen through a different venue. But love to get any ideas you all have about where you think landowners would be most likely to be able to go, and or technical assistance providers, and what would be the most convenient for you.
Kathy, I would say Oregon State really is the logical place. We have the Oregon Climate Change Research Institute there. We have, of course, the Ag Extension, which is a trusted source of information, I think, for a lot of landowners. I actually, they have a new dean or provost or whatever it is, he's only been on the job for, I think, 2 months. I just met him yesterday. And I told him, by the way, Kathy, that he has to meet you sometime soon. Yeah, we need to bring the two of you together. He is really interested not only in climate action, but also, urban forestry and some of those other things that we've been talking about. That seems like a logical choice. Is that the kind of thing you were thinking of, Stan? I mean, Ockree.
Yeah, it exactly is, because it can take a tremendous amount of work to just assemble the information, digest it, make recommendations on it, vet it. But then when you get the information, it's been vetted, and these are the practices we ought to follow and the monitoring that we ought to implement thereafter.
I think that's a good idea for the technical side. I'd like to hear from Bruce Buckmaster, who's actually chair of the climate committee at OWEB, because we not only need to look at the technical side, but we need to look at the finance and the grant side. So maybe Bruce might want to share a little about what the climate committee is working on.
Thanks, Jan. The Climate Committee has proposed a statement of purpose to go before the full board at OWEB to include a climate lens in how we prioritize our funding recommendations, how we evaluate projects in a manner that will include, in addition to our current priorities, but will add a climate lens. The Climate Committee has defined a climate lens for discussion purposes to go before the board. And there'll be discussion on it actually tomorrow afternoon at a coordinating committee meeting. And then hopefully with any additions that are made at that meeting, go before the full board of OWEB. So we have a very strong climate committee, I think anchored by Dr. Brenda McComb who serves on the Forestry Commission, and some others. So we've got some great people that have worked very hard on language. There's a sense that OWEB has, as was mentioned earlier, has done a lot of great things, that you could find climate benefit in most of the projects that OWEB has funded for years. That said, there is a concern that we have not actually looked closely at the climate through a climate lens at those types of projects to look at what will give us the most bang for the buck long term in the state of Oregon. And I think that maybe to go beyond that, there is a DEI that Lisa mentioned earlier this morning, and looking at underserved communities. I think that will give us opportunities to look for projects outside of or in addition to our traditional partners, to start looking at more urban aspects, some of the underserved rural communities, both coastal and in Eastern Oregon. So I think the Climate Committee at OWEB certainly feels that there is a major contribution that OWEB can make through enhancing their existing programs, and hopefully we'll be able to begin moving on that. I think it may take some rule changing, and I will do a shout out for Catherine. The OWEB Climate Committee has been quoting the Global Warming Commission report, as well as Governor Brown's executive order, to some maybe ad nauseum, but we think it's pretty clear what's needed, pretty clear what's directed, and hopefully we will have things put in place at OWEB to put our shoulder to the wheel. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.
So another significant partner of ours in working on this issue is Ron Alvarado, the director of Oregon NRCS, and we need to find a way to communicate among all of us to make this work. So I'd like to ask Ron if he'd like to add some comments as well.
Hi, Jan. Thank you for that. And thank you for this opportunity. I was listening to the conversation, and when I heard private lands, voluntary conservation, agriculture, it was music to my ears. So as you know, NRCS has been around a long time, and our number one goal is to provide technical assistance to farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners across Oregon and across the United States. But as you also know, these resource problems that we're dealing with are complex, and they're becoming more complex. And there's no doubt, NRCS, we have substantial resources available to our agricultural communities, but we can't do it alone. We must and need to leverage and collaborate more and more every day. And that's something I'm proud of here in Oregon, is that, NRCS, we do have a good relationship with our state directors. I leverage not only the financial assistance side of our portfolio, but we leverage boots on the ground with, for example, with ODF&W, with Kurt Melcher, we're leveraging 5 farm bill biologists that we have across the state. With Department of Forestry, we're leveraging the stewardship foresters. We have leveraged CREP techs with OWEB and FSA, and on. So I'm looking forward to us meeting the challenges that were mentioned earlier. I do understand that list of goals that were talked about earlier were a little daunting, but I think we can achieve that. It takes a village. It's about how we collaborate and leverage, and all playing a role in how we knock that list, how we work down that list and achieve, the goals that we want to achieve. So again, with this current budget coming up, we are going to see a bump in our portfolio. And again, it is going to take an effort amongst us all to get that done. And NRCS stands committed to continuing our partnerships and our relationships with state and federal and private entities, nonprofit organizations. So I hope that helps, and I'm always available to answer any questions about USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service and what we do. And I do see our former chief, Jason Weller, so I gotta pay my respects to Mr. Weller there, but thank you, Jan, for that.
Thank you, Ron. Brian, you've had your hand up for a bit.
Yeah, unmute myself. In the context of all the partners that we work with in Oregon, I'm kind of wondering, say if you're trying to sell something to legislators, do we feel that it's important to communicate to them what percentage of the carbon sequestration and other activities we can allow to get to happen for climate change? I mean, do we think it's important? Does anyone think it's important that the legislators understand how much of the pie we could potentially take on as we deal with climate change? Would that matter for the legislators to know that?
Maybe we'll ask the legislators what they think, as well as others.
I'll take a swing at this. I didn't have an understanding of just how important land practices and agricultural practices were to sequestrating carbon until, I don't know, 2016 or so. And information from Project Drawdown came to my attention. And if you haven't run across it, just Google that and it'll get you some great stuff. And since that time, I've become interested and done a little bit of reading myself. And it's exciting. I'll say I find it exciting just because so much of what we can do is what the land is intended to do anyway. And we have a lot of work to do it in those fields, whether it's forestry or wetlands restoration or just better soil management. So taking my enthusiasm at that time and trying to convey it to my House members that were also good-hearted, and I would say pretty interested in climate change, it is a harder thing to explain and sell. The perceived urgency of reducing greenhouse gases is most easily understood from the Democratic side, and I don't know that this is entirely an accurate way to look at it, as an issue of classic polluter pays politics. It's we root out the bad stuff in our environment that we don't like, and so hence I would say we've had a lot of focus on simply industry stack pollution reduction, a focus on transportation fuels and how we reduce that, and then how do we drive coal out of our electric sector. I think for my colleagues, that's been a lot easier to understand. And classic regulatory controls on that are also something we understand. In fact, that's what the governor's EO does. It is classic regulatory command and control. So it's just a little bit outside everybody's experience of environmental protection to be coming at it from this direction. And certainly, I think I would welcome better education of my caucus to help with that, because I think if they add that up with the other benefits of land management, including employment and economic development, that triple bottom line win that Kathy mentioned in her presentation can become more and more powerful in their minds. But it's hard.
Thank you. That's very thorough. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that. I think Ken really frames it perfectly. The other thing that I've noticed is, if in those rare instances where our colleagues are looking at natural lands as an element in this effort, they really kind of draw the line on trees, on forestry. That's what comes to mind immediately, and that ends up as the be all and end all. Whereas the agricultural practices, certainly the marshlands, the coastal marshlands, those are all elements. Those elements of the report are all elements that I think for many of our colleagues will come as, it's not something they're really aware of. Maybe they've heard about, but there is a lot of learning for them to do there. And I would say, just again, following up on what Ken said, that the work that the conservation districts do could be very helpful, very informative in giving that on the ground local perspective for legislators. It's not just the trees. The trees are a powerful weapon, no doubt about it. But there is so much more.
And thank you all. We have time for maybe one more question before we have to move on to our next presentation. Does someone have something they'd like to share or ask? Well, seeing none, I certainly thank all of you for your participation today. And we'll look forward to hearing more about the proposal, and we'll tune in on the 15th when you have another meeting of the commission and catch up with you.
Thank you, Jan, for giving us this time to speak to this important body of work. And for all of you that are on in the meeting today, feel free to reach out to me and provide additional information and perspective. We are not just putting this up on the shelf. We want to be actively advancing this. We are kicking off in earnest our long-term roadmap to our 2035 goals, which will include sequestration strategies. So there's another opportunity to kind of influence what we think we should define as the pathway forward, and look forward to having folks like all of you engaged in helping us think about how to build smart programs that will work well for land managers across the state, and helping us think about this. So thank you.
Well, thank you all. And if you have the time, I'd love to have you stay and listen to Jason as well. Jason Weller joined Land O'Lakes, which many of you know of as a great creamery cooperative. He joined in 2017 and serves as vice president of Truterra, a sustainability division of Land O'Lakes. He's leading that team in generating conservation solutions for farmer cooperative members and owners. And he previously served, as Ron mentioned, as chief of USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, nation's largest lands conservation organization. Prior to serving as chief, Jason also served on the U.S. House Appropriations Subcommittee on Agriculture, the U.S. House Budget Committee, and in the White House Office of Management and Budget. He and his family live in Minnesota. So next, I'd like to introduce Jason.
Greetings, everyone. Ms. Lee, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in OACD's annual conference. I wish we could be there in person, but obviously it's the situation. And Ron, greetings to you as well. I got goosebumps just hearing your voice again, sir. It's great to reconnect with you through this forum and this platform. I really want to credit OECD for bringing up this topic, and I appreciate the invitation to participate. My charge, and I'll do the best I can, was to share a little insights on what's happening in this carbon market. So it actually was really helpful for me to hear a little bit of the prior discussion. I came in about 10 minutes before my start, so I caught some of the conversation. And I want to just at a high level talk about what's emerging. I won't call it yet a market, but there's definitely a lot of interest in this new emerging space for what I'll call carbon assets. And agriculture is in a really unique position as a production system, of course, to feed us, to care for the land, but now to create new classes of assets, new classes of environmental commodities that landowners, whether forested or range or pasture or row crop, there's opportunities here to partake in this new marketplace for services. So I'm going to, at a high level, walk through kind of big picture, and then as we go through the course of my discussion here, we'll get a little bit more fine-tuned and specific as to what's happening and what Truterra and Land Lakes is doing. To be clear, this is not a sales pitch. I wish we were doing work in Oregon. We're not yet. This is more about an example of what's emerging from the private sector. But to be clear, and know, in the end, know that you can take the boy out of NRCS, not the NRCS out of the boy. I'm extremely proud of what the public sector is doing, and all of the work the private sector has started, initiated, is built upon the foundation, the bedrock of USDA, the land grant research institutions, and the saltwater conservation districts of this country. It's this public investment, this legacy of heritage, of locally led approaches to conservation. The original soil health movement began 80 years ago in the wake of our worst ecological disaster in the US, the Dust Bowl, and that continues today. So the legacy is carrying on. And I think the future, frankly, will not happen but for continued public-private investments. And it takes, at the end of the day, a human talking to a human to allow these complex mechanisms to take place. And I think the conservation districts and their partners are going to be supremely well positioned to help land managers partake in this new marketplace opportunity. So I'm going to go through my discussion here, and I have a few slides to help facilitate the discussion. So I start this with just a big picture. If you bear with me, I'm a little bit passionate on this, in that, what we're starting to see emerge are some very significant challenges. And when you look across our continent, it doesn't really matter what ecological indicator you're looking at, from biodiversity to species extinction and threatened and endangered species listings to at-risk species trends. You look at every estuary across the continent is eutrophic. A lot of rivers and streams are challenged with non-point endpoint source pollution. We have a lot of just systemic challenges. And in the face of this, we have a growing global population. In the next 30 years, we'll have 10 billion people to feed. And that will place an enormous strain on our ecosystems and our arable lands to feed and clothe that global population. And we're going to be trying this in the midst of climate change, a changing climate that will have untold impacts on our economies, on our quality of life, on our civil society, frankly, and of course, on our natural resource health. So for me, I feel really passionate. This is a generational challenge, intergenerational significant challenge. I hesitate to say tax, because tax is kind of a trigger word for many folks, but we're really in putting on future generations an enormous weight and challenge on their future quality of life and economic success. And so it behooves us to begin ameliorating these impacts and investing in them today to head off the worst, but also now, not just to be negative about it, but I honestly see this as a huge opportunity for agriculture. So, too often we get enraptured with our creation stories and the founding discussions around the soil conservation movement starting in the 1930s. And we have these antiquated bygone photos of Black Sunday and April 14th, 1935 out of Spearman, Texas. And this notion of the need for a public approach to work with private landowners to steward these natural resource assets. But these aren't just bygone images. I mean, these images are out of North Dakota in 2004 and Kansas in 2008. I mean, we're still seeing, and undoubtedly as well across Oregon, whether it's on the coast or all the way into Eastern Oregon, into the rangeland areas and the cultivated cropland and the specialty crops, you name it. We're seeing the challenges today of what we would still consider natural resource opportunities. And yet we're starting to also better understand this human-induced change in our climate. So what you're seeing here is an estimate of CO2 levels in the atmosphere going back 800,000 years. Climatologists were able to replicate this by going to Antarctica and drilling ice cores deep into the glaciers and glaciated landscape there, and melting the ice and getting out of the gas bubbles, carbon levels and CO2 levels in the atmosphere. And so you can see over the last 800,000 years, the ebb and flow of carbon stocks. We've had ice ages and warming periods, and it's hovered between this 200 to 300 parts per million. And this is where we are today. We're at actually now exceeded this. We're at 419 parts per million. We're taking this heat trapping gas, this blanket that's being emitted into our atmosphere through all sorts of activities. And we're now starting to monkey with and experiment with what this will cause on a huge scale that's unprecedented, at least in the last 800,000 years. And so when climatologists put this into their climate models, this is an example of the ebb and flow of heat, in this case of temperature, where it's used the last 50 years as the mean and backcasting 1,000 years. Again, using those climate carbon CO2 levels in the atmosphere, estimating what would be the mean average temperature referent to the last 50 years. So over the last 1,000 years, we've actually been about 0.5 degree to 1/4 degree centigrade below the last 50 years. But where we're going under current climate models is this over the next century. So by the end of this century, we'll be anywhere between 1.5 to 4 degrees centigrade hotter than we are today. And what this heat will do for weather, for soils, for ecosystems, and our ability, frankly, to feed ourselves, let alone have access to water and all sorts of other environmental services, is a pretty significant challenge. And so we are already starting to see the impacts of this. So when they look at, for example, extreme storm events, this is in the lower 48 here in the United States, and they've looked at under this National Climate Assessment, the 9-year weighted average is that red line, and what's measuring are extreme storm events, and the frequency of these extreme storm events is amplifying. And yet we still also start to see a drying of our soils. So this is a satellite image that's actually estimating change in soil moisture. And in our grain belt, we're starting to actually see in where we feed ourselves is actually the soils are drying. Notwithstanding the stronger rains, we're getting more intense, longer droughts. And the chances of a multi-decadal drought in the grain belt of the United States is increasingly more likely. And we've already experienced extreme drought this past year that heavily impacted Oregon. I actually was out earlier this summer vacation with my family. We did kind of a Pacific Northwest goodwill tour, and we landed in Portland and checked out Tillamook, went up the coast and enjoyed the landscapes in the Pacific beachfront of Oregon. And it was aghast at both the heat and how dry everything was. And this is a little bit of a precursor of what's to come. But beyond the drying and the extreme storms, this key element in our soils we depend upon for cycling nutrients, for filtering water quality, to sustaining microbiological life, to help transform the minerals in the soils through the microbiological activity into plant available nutrition. Our carbon is the key element. We're carbon-based life forms on Earth. It's the key element of life. And yet you can see this is historic and current estimates of carbon stocks in our soils. Globally, through agriculture over the last several thousand years, we have released over 116 billion tons of carbon from our arable soils as a result of agriculture, of cultivation of the soils. About 1/4 of all the greenhouse gas, of the CO2 carbon that's emitted in the atmosphere by humans, has been from the cultivation of arable soils. And so we're losing this necessary and vital element from our soils at the very moment we need it. So what to do about it? So what you're seeing here is a lot of discussion on it. I've been tracking this. It's been a fair amount in the news. And the UN has hosted an event in Glasgow, Scotland, in the United Kingdom this past 2 weeks, talking about the COP26, which is global commitment, bringing the major industrialized nations together, working with developing nations, and coming up with a global plan of action on what we're going to do. Climatologists are telling us we're running out of time. Because carbon, CO2, is a long-lived gas in the atmosphere. Once it's up in the atmosphere, it will stay in the atmosphere for 1,000 years. So it's not something where if you just turn the tap off, things will return. It's like a locomotive or a freight train. Once this thing gets going, there are no brakes. And it will gather steam, and it's very impossible to slow it down once it gets rolling. And so this climate locomotive is now starting to roll. And so what climatologists are telling us, we have basically a 10-year window if we want to head off the worst impacts of a changing climate. So the global goal is to keep the lid on the heat, literally and figuratively. So by year 2050, to have the global mean temperature increase by no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. This is the belief that we will minimize the worst ecological impacts on our ecosystems. In order to achieve that, in the next 10 years, we have to significantly reduce emissions and begin to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. So to quantify that, our current emissions globally we're emitting is around 40 billion tons of carbon every year. Very significant load of forcings in the atmosphere of this greenhouse gas load. We need to begin reducing that annual emissions by 2 billion tons a year. So by the year 2030, a net cumulative every year reduction of around 20 billion tons. That's a huge amount of reduced emissions that it's going to be an unbelievable scientific and industrial challenge. The opportunity is that nature has the designed an approach. She figured this out about 3.5 billion years ago, and it's this little technology called photosynthesis. Nature has been synthesizing carbon to the atmosphere for as long as there's been photosynthetic life on Earth. And through agriculture, through both agroforestry, range and pasture management, but also from cultivated cropland, we can harness the ability of plants to synthesize carbon into organic matter and into liquid carbons and return that to the soil. So it's a nature-based approach, a nature-based solution to both reduce emissions, but importantly, to grab and capture that difficult carbon and put it back in the soils where, frankly, we most need it. Agriculture in the US is roughly 10% of the annual emissions. So when you add up the total load of greenhouse gas from the US economy, agriculture is roughly 1/10 of the total carbon emissions for the country. Crop production is over half, about half of ag's greenhouse gas emissions. And followed by that is methane, predominantly from livestock production. Is roughly 1/3 of ag's carbon footprint. So we have a responsibility, but in that, through photosynthesis and conservation systems, there's a huge opportunity now to position farmers and ranchers and landowners to be that nature-based solution, that drawdown strategy. Why companies are starting to talk about carbon, why there's this fever around carbon, this froth, is because you have very serious people. In this case, Larry Fink, I've quoted here. He is the CEO of BlackRock Inc. BlackRock Inc. is one of the largest private equity investors in the world. They currently manage close to $10 trillion in financial assets. So when Larry Fink speaks, I assure you, everyone listens, particularly in the private sector. And he often is the trendsetter, or he is helping to set, I think, the opinion of Wall Street and the investment community. His quotation here is that there's no company whose business model won't be profoundly affected by the transition to a net zero economy. And companies that are not quickly preparing themselves will see their businesses and valuations suffer. So when Larry Fink and other investors are starting to position their investment portfolios and call a clear call to action for the private sector to take heed, to understand their exposure and risk to changing climate, but also if they want access to funding, to investment, they have to have a game plan for carbon and for the greenhouse gas impacts. And so it's no surprise in the last 1.5 years, you've had major international global companies. It feels like every week another company's launched another program, another carbon offer, another carbon commitment that is just, it's been gathering steam. So you can see some of the headlines here. And here's just the point is that there's a lot. As a result, now you have in agriculture, at least 14 that I can count. There's probably more that have come online since I built this deck. This is a matrix we're kind of tracking of all the different carbon programs out there for agriculture. So there is an absolute rush of new service providers coming into this space. And I think it behooves the public sector and the conservation community to understand these programs, understand, I think, the veracity and the scientific credibility of these offers, and figure out how does the public approach complement the private approach. We at Truterra are very intentional in designing our protocols and our standards to practice, and based upon USDA NRCS practice standards. We utilize the conservation planning framework of NRCS. We utilize a lot of the estimation tools NRCS uses, and we use those core conservation practices for climate smart agriculture based upon NRCS's recommendations. We've intentionally designed ourselves to complement very strategically the public approach. So turning to Land O'Lakes briefly, Land O'Lakes, as Jane did a great job of introducing, we're a 100-year-old farmer co-op. We were created 100 years ago, in 1921, here in St. Paul, Minnesota, as a creamery. We still are one of the largest dairy creameries in the United States. We're proud to have 1,600 dairy farmers across the United States. We have 3 primary milk sheds in California, in the upper Midwest, and in the Mid-Atlantic on the East Coast. And as a result, we are a global food company. But beyond dairy, we are also a global ag inputs and crop insights business. We're a federated cooperative system. We have 1,000 farmer co-ops that own Land O'Lakes. We are a huge farmer-owned, retailer, co-op-owned organization that have a number of owners, as I said, 1,000 owners here in the United States. We also have agricultural retailer owners in Canada. So we're a North American enterprise. And so we have 4 main businesses at Land O'Lakes. So Winfield United is our crop inputs and crop insights distribution company. They're a multi-billion-dollar company in themselves. They work with those 1,000 retailer owners to service them with their crop inputs needs. We are Purina, so not Nestle Purina. If it barks or meows, that's Nestle. But if it moos, neighs, or clucks, that's us. So we're a large animal nutrition feeding business. And then I've already talked about our dairy foods business. We're a global dairy foods company. Truterra sits amidst this. We connect the upstream and the downstream, farmers to the consumer in this sustainability arena. And we partner with these companies, and we partner with a number of global businesses outside of Land O'Lakes to help deliver on their global sustainability commitments, including advancing carbon. Simplistically, all the different sources of greenhouse gases, from carbon dioxide to CH4, methane to N2O, nitrous oxide, the 3 primary greenhouse gases emanating from agriculture. We have begun our journey focusing on carbon in this arena. We're using soil health systems, conservation tillage, crop rotation, cover crops to help be that drawdown strategy to remove carbon. But we're going to be launching this year a more expansive approach, looking holistically in livestock and across crop fertility and crop production systems, as well as energy efficiency, looking holistically on the farm. How do we get a handle on emissions from the farm, quantify it, help adopt practices, and then give the farmer credit for those environmental services they're providing and get them paid for that service. We have a tool we do this with. I'm not going to go deep into the tool, but we gather a lot of precision data from the farm, from the farmer's equipment, off their John Deere planter or their tractor, from their farm management information system. They may be using a digital tool to plan their crop fertility program for the year, as well as from their agricultural retailer that will have an ERP system that's tracking all their services. And from this, we can create a sustainability score. So as you can see on the left there, it's like your FICO score, your credit rating for your field, where we're synthesizing a lot of complex conservation principles this community, the OACD, would recognize. And we're benchmarking every field for its leaching risk, its runoff risk, its wind erosion risk, and how close that field is to a river or stream, blue water. And so we're helping characterize for that farmer how good a job they are to managing those risks. We also have our Practice Navigator tool. We're helping them visualize literally profitability in the field. So not just yield, but now putting and showing them where their working dollar is making money or losing money. And invariably where it's losing money, that's where there's a conservation opportunity. It's where you have erosion occurring, where you're losing carbon from your soils, where you're getting nitrate leaching into your tile line or into the groundwater. And so where we can identify low profit areas, problem spots, that's where we can then apply conservation principles through nutrient management, soil health practices, and other structural practices to get a handle on that profit loss, but also improve sustainability. We create for every field nitrogen use efficiency metrics, sheet and rill and erosion and wind erosion metrics. We're giving them an SCI soil quality trend, which is a precursor for soil carbon. We're giving them net greenhouse gas estimates, where we're quantifying total CO2 and N2O release from their soils. It's a live interactive tool. They can plug and play practices and get instant feedback how switching to less intensive tillage or adopting cover crops or putting in a field border, what does that do to all these core metrics? And we can create high resolution erosion and soil carbon maps in their fields in a live interactive tool. We can show them where erosion is occurring under current management and at what rates, what tonnage per year. And then we can also show them at a subfield scale where they're predicted to be both sequestering carbon and actually burning carbon out of their soils. So what do we do with all this? We have a number of food system projects. We work with global food supply chain companies that want insights into their supply chains. We have carbon services, which I'll talk very briefly about. We also are working on water quality markets, where we're getting farmers paid for their water quality services. In terms of carbon markets, which Jan asked me to talk about, we're proud that we have the only farmer-centric ag-retailer-driven carbon program in the United States. We just completed our first round of sales. So we launched our carbon offer in February, and we had significant interest from across the United States. In the end, we only had enough quantity of carbon to actually sell. We were very fortunate to have a buyer on hand. Microsoft actually wanted to purchase carbon from our network, and they held a global competition, and Truterra won that service contract. So we're their only North American provider for solar organic carbon. And the first tranche was for 100,000 metric tons as a trial balloon. And in the end, we're successful. So we had over 1,200 farmers enroll. We were only in the end able to transact with about 120 farmers, because that's the total quantity of carbon we were able to deliver to Microsoft. We are, as we speak, we've already issued over $3 million in cash payments to farmers this fall for their carbon sequestration services. And we've really designed a turnkey approach where we have farmers focus on what they're best at: grain production and stewardship, managing the land, and then Truterra behind the scenes manages the verification, the data collection, the soil testing, the quantification, a lot of the complexity that is a barrier to entry for a lot of farmers. So in the end, I'll close this out, and I'd like to just open up for questions and feedback. In the end, we're passionate about this. We're farmer co-op. I'm extremely proud of the private sector, privately led, voluntary approach, incentive-based solutions for agriculture. And we have almost a century of experience doing this, and it works. And I don't care whether you're in Oregon to Maine and every state in between, we have a proven approach to work with land managers and landowners to steward their natural resources. And the types of practices we're talking about here, you guys will recognize and work with every day. To adopt climate smart practices, it's not just artisanal new technologies. These are tried and true practices that we've been using to restore pastures, or to address sensitive areas with conservation cover, or to look at stream areas that have been eroded or denuded from vegetation and restoring them into a natural verdant landscape with pollinator habitat and aquatic species habitat, or getting the cows out of the creek, literally and figuratively, and restoring that to a stream bank where we have, again, opportunities for water quality improvement and carbon storage. Or instead of farming up to the edge of the ditch or the creek, we're actually putting in place habitat for upland bird species and field borders to, again, filter and protect that land and keep the soils in place and reduce that loss of nutrients from the edge of the field. And helping farmers adopt soil health management systems, where you don't need to get out and get a soil probe and estimate what's happening in those fields. You can visually and literally see what's occurring through just biomass production, where farmers are using on the left comprehensive soil health management systems, or they take a more traditional conventional approach. And you just know there's going to be a different crop outcome and a different soil health profile in those fields. And when you do a side-by-side comparison, a soil health management system is the best solution we have, the best long-term hedge to a changing climate, to weather severe events, to withstand droughts, to attenuate rainfall and snow, and to provide for a verdant future, while we're also providing carbon services for a globe that's looking for ways to get the carbon out of the atmosphere. So with that, Jan, I will cease and desist. I know I threw a lot at you and the team here. I appreciate folks' patience as I walk through some of this information. I'd be happy to kind of go into any level of detail you want here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Does someone have a question they'd like to ask of Jason? I have one. When are you moving to Oregon with a program that's similar?
So right now, we are mostly focused here in the Midwest. We are a national enterprise. We have owners on the West Coast. By owners, I'm sorry, I'm a co-op. We have farmer co-ops, retailers that are on the West Coast as well. We're in the Southeast, so we are national, but our initial service has been focused mostly in the corn and wheat belt. So Central Plains states and the I states. We are building out our technology and capabilities that will now be scalable across the country and in all relevant crop types. We're not yet in pasture and grazing, so we're staying true to really our roots and where we have most expertise and bandwidth, and that's going to be for now in cultivated cropland. We are, however, going to be moving into dairy, and we're building out a dairy platform. So in the livestock arena, we have aspirations to be more expansive for our services, and we're looking holistically on the dairy farm, looking at the feed and forage. So there's soil, carbon, and greenhouse gas mitigations opportunities. But we're also then looking at enteric emissions as well as manure. So all the basic major loss pathways on the dairy farm for methane and N2O and CO2, we're going to be deploying that tool late next year. So if we have partners and customers in Oregon, it's a long answer to your question, Jan. We hope to get there soon, but it's making sure we actually have our technology and we have our capabilities. And the way we work, we're a small team. There are only 30 people on the Truterra team. We don't go direct to the farmer. We need partners to go to the farmer. So here in the Midwest, we're working with conservation districts, are actually taking our technology and enrolling their customers in using our tool. We have other conservation partners like Pheasants Forever. They do a lot of work in Oregon. They're taking our platform out. Their farm bill biologists are using the Truterra technology to consult with their customers. So we have a number of different ways that we want to partner. And to be clear, we're not making money with the farmer. Our view is that the downstream customer should pay. And that's our approach, that there's the companies that want to access these claims and these markets should be the ones that are frankly helping to incentivize and put these capabilities in the hands of farmers and their conservation advisors. So we really are interested in sincerely in partners who want to collaborate and help us get to the farm.
We have a couple questions in chat, and then after that, I'll have Stan ask his question. Dean Moberg asks, given the viability of soil carbon and thus the difficulty of making accurate measurements of soil sequestration, do you think it makes sense for stationary sources like smokestacks where carbon sequestration can be accurately measured to buy those credits from farms?
So yeah, there's a lot embedded in that question. So I'll do my best to be brief. What the question is getting at are the two most important components that sets really, I think, the credibility and creditability of carbon, right? And that's additionality. So how much additional carbon can you quantify you're removing from the atmosphere? And how durable is it? How long will it stay in the ground? So you have kind of two ends of the spectrum here. You have, and it's been discussed when I came into this call, right? Trees. And there are viable global forested carbon programs where you can go and purchase carbon credits, carbon assets from forested programs. And that the price will fluctuate anywhere from $5 a metric ton up to $10 or $15 a metric ton. On the other end of the spectrum, what the questioner is getting at is you have new technologies that are emerging. These are engineered solutions. They're called direct air capture systems, direct air carbon capture systems. Most famously, there's one that just launched in Iceland that you may have seen some news about. Their facility is called Climeworks, and they just turned on the fans. What they do is they blow atmosphere through and they heat it up, the atmosphere, the air, and when it gets hot, they have special technology will actually strip the carbon out of that and liquefy it, and then they inject it into the ground, deep into the basalt rock, and it transforms into a mineral. So it's a very sophisticated approach and an engineered solution where you can actually literally measure the gauges that carbon's going down in the ground, and once it transforms into rock, it'll be there until the next volcanic eruption. So, but that costs anywhere from $1,000 to $1,200 a ton. Okay, so when you think about in the middle here, this is where agriculture has this opportunity to be this bridge technology, and farmers can sequester carbon depending on the producer, right, and their costs to install these conservation systems. Their cost to install and maintain will fluctuate, but let's just take an argument, say it's anywhere from $10 to $30 an acre per year to maintain these practices. So they can provide very competitive, if you're just comparing technology to technology, very competitive approaches to removing and storing carbon. The questioner is like, well, how much do you know is really in the ground and how long will that really stay there? And that's where these carbon programs need to be integrated with conservation planning, and it needs to be integrated with agronomy solutions. This can't be shake and bake where you throw out some cereal rye cover crops and you expect the carbon to be there for 100 years. It needs to be integrated with the producer's operation, with their crop rotation, with their nutrient management plan, with their business goals, their equipment, and a conservation plan. And our experience is when you consult and support the producer through that transition and these adoptions to the systems, that the practices will stick. And if you talk to long-term no-tillers that have been in no-till soil health systems for 10 years, even 5 years, they'll never go back. They're more profitable, they have better quality of life, and they actually see how their fields are more resilient, not just more profitable. So we have a very sophisticated quantification methodology we go through. We're actually sampling the soils and doing a stratification by soil type. We're comparing case controls, so treated fields versus untreated fields, and we're detecting and modeling. It's a combination of both testing and modeling that delta, that change in soil organic carbon storage. So yeah, we don't have a meter on the tailpipe, but we have the most sophisticated approach to actually quantifying that carbon. And we're very confident that these systems are competitive from a cost basis and from a scientific credibility basis.
And the other question that was in chat relates to that, asking if the standard platform or measuring mechanism is something that you use. And we know there are a number of different software programs that do that. And the questioner asked if it might be better for either government or private industry to come up with that mechanism.
So there are a number of different registries. So it's how far, Jan, do you want to go into this swamp?
Well, maybe
I'm trying to keep everyone
further.
out of this mire. I'll try and keep it out of the ditch. There are a number of registries where a private buyer will come. So there isn't yet an exchange. There's not a Chicago Board of Exchange here. We can go and, or New York Stock Exchange, and, you can see the current spot price for a ton of soil organic carbon. That probably will be coming, but not yet. And so where it's an over-the-counter transaction, so it's largely a business-to-business transaction. And for the buyer to have trust that they're buying something that is quantifiable and credible, they want to go through a registry, and the registry will write the rules. So these are private voluntary registries. And so companies like Land O'Lakes, True Terra at Land O'Lakes, we develop protocols, public available protocols and methodologies. And then we are working with the registries to essentially put our carbon transactions through. So it's not government regulated, but it is regulated by the scientific community in the sense, if you have not reliable or not credible scientific methodology, you're not going to get buyers. And so there's some discipline that the market is putting in place here. But there are also a lot of different providers. You saw one slide. You can count down. There's at least 14 programs. And it is like, I don't know if you guys are sci-fi fans, but it's like that scene, the first Star Wars movie, The New Hope, where Luke walks into that bar and Tatooine. It's like this intergalactic consortium of bounty hunters. There's a lot of folks in that bar scene in the carbon market, and there's some really good folks, and there are some companies that are just new startups and they haven't yet proven themselves. And so there's definitely a kind of a buyer beware approach to this. Land O'Lakes is trying to be as transparent and scientifically credible and fact-based and pro-farmer as possible. And we believe in the end, that approach, a farmer-first approach founded in conservation science principles created by USDA and all the public sector agencies that have been doing this work for 100 years, that's the winning solution.
Thank you. And Stan, your question?
Quick one. I think you partially answered my question about guarantees for the carbon staying in the soil long term. And you mentioned that once farmers adopt these new practices, they won't go back. But do you have any other mechanisms for making sure that they don't go back?
So other programs do. We do not. I'll tell you why. Because farming happens. And so we think differently about it. We have an insurance pool. So we think of almost like a mutual fund approach. We think about our carbon program at the project scale. So we have several thousand fields now enrolled. in our carbon program that in part it's geographically dispersed because of the need to actually spread the risk ecologically, right? You're one drought or ice storm or windstorm or flood away from losing a year, a crop year. And as we've seen in Iowa, I don't know if you guys saw the news that last year, there was this incredible storm event in Iowa called the derecho, which was like basically a land hurricane that impacted something like, I don't know, 10 million acres of corn production in Iowa. It went across Iowa and just nuked a significant portion of Iowa's corn crop. There's zero way you can predict where and when that will happen. And the only way a lot of growers can get rid of that corn was frankly to harvest and bale it, or frankly, chop it up and till it into the ground. So our approach to our carbon program is we enroll the farmer and we're asking for a 5-year commitment. From the buyer, we're guaranteeing a 20-year durability commitment at a minimum. And we think about this then not at the farm scale and field scale, we're thinking about the project scale. So as long as the overall project, like a mutual fund, is returning what we've guaranteed to the buyer for carbon removal and storage, and then we allow farmers to put and take, you know, if the land gets sold or they have a storm event, they got to do some cultivation of the soil, whatever farming happens, we're not asking the farmer to commit to a 20 or 100-year contract, which some other programs are requiring. That's difficult given current land management, especially when you get into intergenerational conversations with a farmer. That's tough to commit to. So we're trying to make this manageable and in bite-sized chunks, but at the project scale, we're managing for durability for at least over a generation, over 20 years. So Nancy made a comment. I just got to put an exclamation point on that one. And she stated that, you know, this is why we need transition and technical assistance for farmers, ranchers, and landowners. 1000% agree. I mean, so you could have all the fancy tools and graphics and blah, blah, blah. If you're not having a conversation with a land manager about the value of conservation, if you're not understanding and walking the land with them and understanding their business goals, but as well as their conservation challenges, if you're not with them year over year and helping them adopt new practices, see how they work, adapt, make changes in your management. This is a multi-year transition and a multi-year effort to assist producers to adopt these systems. And technical assistance is the heart of all of this. 100% agree with Ms. Hamilton's statement there. And this is where I think the conservation community broadly and conservation districts specifically, because of your locally led approach, your connection to landowners, your connection to the land literally, are supremely well positioned to help growers make the best choices and get their farms either carbon ready or help them maintain these practices for the long haul. And yeah, fancy tools and data science and all this other stuff, it's not going to come in an app out of Silicon Valley, that I promise you. It's going to take tried and true approaches to conservation and conservation adoption and technical assistance and conservation planning. That's the most important component in this whole effort. Jen, you're still muted there.
We thank you very much for your participation. It's really an eye opener to see what can be accomplished in a program like this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate your time and thank you for your questions.
And Ron, did you want to say something?
I was just going to say thank you for joining us today, and hopefully someday we'll cross paths to see how we can work together here.
Yeah, that would be really good. It would be chicken soup for my soul.
Okay.
Really good to see you, Ron.
Yeah, you too. You take care.
All right, take care.
Okay, thank you all. I'm not sure what that, Leo, are you trying to buzz us? Oh, I'm not sure what that sound was, but it's time for our break, and I hope you'll come back at 3:15 and hear from Tom Byler, because he needs to have input from all of you on some of the water resource programs. Thank you.